Welcome to Velvet Echoes. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button. We tell stories that stay with you long after they're done. And drop a comment below letting us know what city you're watching from. We love seeing where our listeners are. Now, settle in. This one takes a little while to unfold, but it's worth every minute. He had built a company from a shared desk in a Waterloo co-working space to a 40-floor tower in downtown Toronto with his name on the lease. He had closed a deal in Singapore while eating a cold sandwich at 2 a.m. He had sat across the table from men who wanted to dismantle everything he'd made and smiled at them until they flinched first. Callum Reeves had never been a man who fell apart easily. But he was standing in the lobby of the Fairmont Royal York on a Tuesday in March. And he had gone completely still, not from the marble floors, not from the chandelier light catching the gold fixtures above the concierge desk, not from any of the thousand small elegances of a building he had walked through dozens of times before. He had gone still because of the woman standing near the far end of the lobby, holding the hand of a small girl in a red coat. And because beside that woman stood two boys, roughly the same height, wearing matching navy sweaters, both of them looking up at the ceiling, with their mouths open, the way children do when something enormous has finally registered as real. Callum knew the shape of that woman, the way you know the layout of a house you grew up in, without thinking, without effort, before your eyes have even finished the work. Sylvia. He hadn't seen her in 6 years. The city outside was still doing what Toronto does in early March, gray sky, leftover grit on the sidewalks, the kind of cold that doesn't bite, but simply stays. He had been on his way to a dinner, a function for a charity board he sat on, nothing that required him to feel anything in particular. He watched Sylvia crouch down to the smaller of the two boys, who had apparently decided the lobby carpet was more interesting than the ceiling, and was now attempting to lie flat on it. She said something. The boy reconsidered. He stood back up. She adjusted the collar of his sweater with the automatic efficiency of a woman who had done this 10,000 times, and then she straightened and looked around the lobby, and her eyes landed on Callum. She didn't run. She didn't flinch. She held his gaze for 1 second, 2, 3, and he watched something move across her face. Not guilt, not fear. Something older and quieter than either of those things. Recognition, maybe. The particular exhaustion of a thing that had been postponed for too long finally arriving. She said something to the children. All three of them looked over at him. Callum Reeves, who had negotiated with people who wanted to destroy him and smiled, felt the lobby tilt very slightly beneath his feet. Her full name was Sylvia Okafor Reeves. She had kept the hyphen after the divorce, which his lawyer had noted in paperwork, and which Callum had never asked her about. They had been married for 4 years. They had separated when Callum was 34 and Sylvia was 31, and the official reason on the paperwork was irreconcilable differences, which is the legal language, for we stopped being able to find each other in the same room. What the paperwork didn't say was this, that the separation had been orchestrated, quietly and over the course of 18 months, by Callum's mother. Her name was Beverly Reeves. She was 71 years old, lived in a condominium in Yorkville, and had opinions about everything. The city, the weather, the appropriate firmness of a handshake, and Sylvia. She had never said outright that she disliked her daughter-in-law. She was far too careful for that. What she had done instead was spend 1.5 years making small cuts. A comment here about Sylvia taking her away from home. A suggestion there that certain friends of Sylvia's were perhaps not a stabilizing influence. A question, raised with apparent innocence, about whether Sylvia had mentioned her plans for the holidays. Because she told me something different, I might have misunderstood. Callum hadn't seen it as it was happening. That was the part that still sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't shift. He had been busy. He had been growing a company. He had told himself that the friction between his wife and his mother was a normal thing, a generational thing, a thing that would smooth itself out with time. He had chosen, again and again, to be in the middle, rather than beside Sylvia, and she had felt it every single time, and eventually she had stopped trying to tell him. The separation had happened quickly, at the end. 3 weeks from the first conversation to Sylvia, moving out. She had been calm about it. almost frighteningly calm. She had said, "I don't think you see me anymore, Callum. I don't think you've seen me in a long time." He had said things in response that he no longer remembered clearly, and then the door had closed and she was gone. He found out she was pregnant through a mutual friend 4 months later. By then the divorce was finalized. He had called her. She had not answered. He had called twice more. She had not answered those times either, and he had made himself believe that she didn't want his involvement, that she had made her position clear, that respecting her choice was the right thing to do. He had not tried hard enough. He knew that now, had known it for years in the way you know something you've decided not to look at directly. The child in the red coat, the 2 boys in navy sweaters, 3 children. She walked toward him. He stayed where he was, because his feet had apparently made that decision independently. "Callum," she said when she was close enough. "Sylvia." The 2 boys had stationed themselves slightly behind her, studying him with the particular focused attention of children, assessing an unknown variable. The girl in the red coat had her face half turned into Sylvia's side. "This is a surprise," Sylvia said. Her voice was steady. She had always been steadier than him. "I didn't know you were in the city," he said. And even as he said it, he understood how inadequate it was, not just as a sentence, but as an accounting of 6 years of silence. "We live here," she said. "We moved back from Vancouver 18 months ago." He looked at the children again. He couldn't stop himself. The taller of the 2 boys had Sylvia's forehead, the particular clean line of it, but his jaw, the set of his shoulders even at whatever age he was. 5? 6? Something about the way he was standing, with his weight slightly back, watching and waiting. Callum knew that posture. He had seen it in photographs of himself. "How old?" he said, and then stopped, because the question had too many implications stacked inside it, and he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. Sylvia looked at him for a moment. She seemed to be running some internal calculation. Then she said, quietly, "They're 5, all 3 of them, triplets." He hadn't known. He hadn't let himself find out. She agreed to a coffee. They sat in a corner of the hotel's lobby cafe, far enough from the main corridor to have some degree of quiet, close enough that the children had a clear sightline to a small play area. Near the window. The girl in the red coat, whose name was Adiezi, had already made friends with a decorative wooden train. The 2 boys, Kofi and Marcus, were conducting some kind of quiet negotiation over which of them would sit nearest the window. Kofi won. Marcus relocated with the resigned dignity of a much older person. Callum watched all of this. He didn't say anything for a while. "You called," Sylvia said finally. She was holding her coffee with both hands. "After you found out, you called 3 times. You didn't answer." "I know." She looked at the table. "I was angry. I was scared. I just found out it was 3, and I was doing the math on what that actually meant for the next 20 years, and She stopped. "I was wrong not to answer. I know that. But I was also 29 weeks pregnant and living in a basement suite in East Vancouver, and I had just spent 18 months watching your mother slowly convince you that I was the problem, and I didn't have anything left to argue with." Callum said nothing. The stone in his chest had gotten heavier. "I blocked your number after the 3rd call," she said. "And then I told myself you'd stop trying, and you did." She said it without accusation. That was almost worse. "I half expected you to show up at the door, or have someone find out You had the resources. I didn't think you wanted me to." "I know. That's the part that took me the longest to stop being angry about." She finally looked up at him. "Not that you didn't try harder, just that you'd been trained so thoroughly to interpret my boundaries as absolute rejection. She did that, you know. Your mother. She spent 1.5 years teaching you that when Sylvia says stop, she means forever. And you learned the lesson very well." The lobby moved around them. Someone laughed near the check-in desk. Kofi had pulled a small car from somewhere in his pocket and was running it along the window ledge with the focused satisfaction of a boy. With important work to do, Marcus was watching Callum. "He does that," Sylvia said quietly. "Watches people. He wants to figure out what you are before he decides anything. He gets that from me." Callum said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," she said. "He does. He missed his charity dinner. He texted an apology to the board chair and put his phone away and stayed." Sylvia didn't ask him to, and didn't object when he did. They talked for 2 hours in the lobby cafe while the children moved between the play area and the table in a pattern that seemed to have its own logic. Adese came back periodically to check on her mother with a frequency that suggested she was keeping some kind of internal schedule. She was precise about it in a way that made Callum smile, genuinely, without thinking about it. And something in her face shifted slightly, like a door that had been held shut, moving a fraction on its hinges. It was Kofi who spoke to him first. He arrived at Callum's elbow without announcement, holding the small car, and looked up with Sylvia's eyes and said, "Do you know what kind of car this is?" Callum looked at it. A small die-cast model, dark green, slightly battered around one rear wheel. "That's a 67 Jaguar E-Type," he said. "Where did you get that?" "Grandpa Okafor," Kofi said, with the gravity appropriate to an heirloom. "Your grandfather has good taste." Kofi considered this, apparently found it satisfactory, and returned to the window. Callum looked at Sylvia. She was looking at her coffee. Marcus hadn't come to the table yet. He was still at the window, still watching. Callum had the feeling that he would be waiting a while for that particular judgment to come in, and that it would be worth the wait when it did. They had been separated for 6 years. He had built 3 more companies in that time, acquired 2, sold 1, and moved into a house on the bridle path that had more rooms than he had ever needed. His mother came for Sunday dinners when invited, and he had learned, slowly and at some cost, to hear the edge in certain things she said, to catch the small redirections, the quiet suggestions, the shape of her influence before it had time to land. He had never remarried. He had come close once, a woman named Philippa, an architect he had met through friends, intelligent and warm and genuinely good. After 8 months, he had told himself it was the timing. He had known, somewhere below the level of things he was willing to examine, that it wasn't. Sylvia had not remarried either. She had a small interior design practice. She ran from a studio in Leslieville. She had 2 employees and a client list that had grown steadily over 4 years. The children went to a school 12 minutes from the studio, and she picked them up herself on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The other days they had a nanny, a woman named Frances, who had been with them since Vancouver. The 3 of them had apparently decided, through some collective process, opaque to all adults, that Frances was acceptable, and that her lemon shortbread specifically was non-negotiable. He learned all of this over the course of the 2 hours, in pieces, in the way you learn things when a conversation is trying to cover 6 years without collapsing under the weight of them. When Sylvia finally said she needed to get the children to bed, he stood with her. They walked to the lobby entrance together. A Daisy had fallen asleep in her coat in the play area and needed to be carried. Kofi was managing his shoes with excessive concentration. Marcus stood near the door, watching Callum with the same careful attention he had maintained all evening. "Can I see them?" Callum said. It came out quieter than he had intended. "Again, I'm not asking for anything formal. I know what you're asking," Sylvia said. She was adjusting a daisy against her shoulder. The girl didn't stir. "Give me some time to think about how to explain it to them. They know they have a father. I never lied to them about that. But knowing a thing and meeting the person are different. I understand. I'm not sure you do," she said, without unkindness. "But you will." She turned toward the door. Marcus had not moved. He was still looking at Callum. Then, with a gravity that seemed entirely inappropriate for a 5-year-old and exactly right for this particular 5-year-old, he said, "Are you going to come back?" Callum crouched down, eye level. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to come back." Marcus looked at him for another long moment. Then he nodded, once decisively, and turned and walked through the door after his mother. He came back. The first time was a Sunday afternoon in a park near their house in Riverdale. Sylvia's idea, neutral ground, somewhere the children could ignore him without social obligation if they chose to. Adese made that choice initially, staying close to Sylvia and regarding Callum with the reserved assessment of someone who had not yet decided whether to update her prior. Kofi had brought the Jaguar again and launched immediately into an extended briefing on its damage history, which Callum received with full attention. Marcus sat on a bench nearby and read a picture book and periodically looked over the top of it. The second time was a weekday. Sylvia had asked if he wanted to help with the thing she had described as the ongoing infrastructure catastrophe, which turned out to be a flat-pack bookshelf that had been sitting in its box for 4 weeks because neither she nor Francis had found the time. Callum assembled it in 40 minutes. Kofi sat nearby and provided commentary. At some point, a daze appeared, inspected the progress, handed Callum a screw he hadn't asked for but did in fact need, and returned to whatever she had been doing. He didn't make anything of it. He just said thank you and kept going. Marcus came in near the end, looked at the completed bookshelf and said, "It's crooked." Callum looked at it. It was, in fact, extremely slightly crooked, maybe 2 millimeters off true, on the left side, which he had noticed and decided was within acceptable range. "You're right," he said. Marcus looked at him. "Are you going to fix it? Do you want me to?" A pause. "Yes." He fixed it. Marcus watched the entire process. When it was done, he said nothing, but he sat down next to Callum on the floor, not touching, not particularly close, but adjacent, and they both looked at the bookshelf. That was the moment Callum understood that he was going to be here, not as a concept, not as an intention, as a person, on the floor, next to this child, for as long as they'd have him. It wasn't easy. There were weeks where Sylvia and Callum circled each other carefully, the old injuries too present in the room to pretend otherwise. He had to learn not to defer, not to retreat when she drew a boundary. She had to learn, and he could see her learning it, watching the old wariness in her softened degree. By degree, that when he showed up he meant it, and that he was not going to let his mother, or his schedule, or his own spectacular capacity for avoidance take him away from this. Beverly had to be dealt with. That conversation happened on a Thursday evening, in Yorkville, in Beverly's immaculate living room, with the lake, gray and enormous, out the window behind her. He had thought about how to do it for 2 weeks. He had decided in the end on directness. He told her what he knew, not the things he suspected. The things he could trace, specifically. The comments, the suggestions, the years of quiet work she had done to position Sylvia as someone who couldn't be trusted. He told her that he was rebuilding a relationship with his children and with Sylvia, and that he needed her to understand clearly what her involvement and its limits would look like going forward. He was calm about it. He did not raise his voice. He said everything he needed to say, and then he waited. Beverly said she didn't know what he was talking about. She said she had always supported his marriage. She said Sylvia had been difficult, and it wasn't fair to blame Beverly for problems that Sylvia had created. Callum had expected this. He had sat with the fact that he would not get an acknowledgement, might never get one, and had decided that this couldn't be a condition of his own forward movement. "Okay," he said when she had finished. "You don't have to agree with me. I just need you to understand where the lines are." He stayed for another 20 minutes. He was civil. He drove home. When Sylvia asked how it had gone, he said, "About how I expected," and she had looked at him, really looked at him, and nodded and said, "That's actually the right answer." The bookshelf. The Sunday afternoons, the Tuesday pickups that he started joining ran late. A Tuesday became a Thursday. A Thursday became every Tuesday and Thursday, and a standing Sunday that a days eventually began to call Bookshelf's Day for reasons that made sense, only to her. He was careful. He didn't push. He followed their lead, each on their own timeline. Adayez was last to give ground, but when she did it with her whole self, the way children do when they've finally made up their minds. She started texting him things, not messages, exactly, just pictures. A cloud that looked like a duck, a leaf she had found shaped like a hand, a screenshot of a dog wearing sunglasses, with no accompanying explanation. He kept every one of them. Marcus remained watchful, but slowly, so slowly, that Callum barely noticed the movement until it had happened. The watching shifted in quality, less assessment. More something that didn't have a good word, more like a child who has decided that a person belongs in his field of vision and would notice if they weren't there. On a Saturday in November, 8 months after the lobby of the Fairmont, Callum was sitting on the floor of the living room in Riverdale, helping Kofi construct an elaborate track system for a set of toy cars, and Marcus came and sat down beside him and started adding pieces. without asking and without explaining himself, and Kofi moved over to make room, and Sylvia came in from the kitchen with 2 cups of tea and paused in the doorway and looked at the 3 of them on the floor. She set 1 cup of tea beside Callum. She didn't say anything. She went back to the kitchen. He stayed for dinner. He stayed after dinner while the children were being put to bed. He was part of that now. On the evenings, he was there. A role he had stepped into incrementally and never formally been given. When the house was quiet and the kitchen had been cleaned, and they were sitting at the table with whatever was left of the evening, Sylvia said, "I need to ask you something. Okay. Are you doing this because of them? Or are you doing this because of us?" He had thought about this, not just since she asked, but for months. He had sat with something you need to understand before you say it. "Both," he said. "I don't think I can separate them cleanly. But I know the answer isn't one and not the other." He looked at her. "I know what I walked away from. I know why I did it, and I know it was wrong. I'm not asking you to forgive me for that on a schedule. I'm asking you to let me be here and to let me show you that I've figured out the difference between being present and just being in the room." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the street was doing what Toronto streets do in November. Lights on early, a few leaves still clinging to the maples, someone walking a dog somewhere in the middle distance. "I already know the difference. That's why I let you stay." He moved some things to the Riverdale house in December. Not everything. Not yet. Not until the right conversation had been had and the children had been part of it, and the decision had been made carefully and together the way they were making things now. But enough to indicate a direction. A coat in the hallway, a shelf in the bathroom, a chair in the corner of the kitchen that became, over the course of a few weeks, definitively his chair. Kofi christened it formally. He placed the E-type Jaguar on the armrest one evening and said, "That's so, people know. It's yours," and then went to watch television, and Callum sat there for a while. After that, in his chair, in the kitchen that was becoming his kitchen, in the house that was becoming something larger than a word he had a name for yet. The first morning, he woke up there. Really woke up, not the careful guest hours of the early months, but the slow and ordinary 8 o'clock of a household that had absorbed him. He lay in the dark and listened. The sound of the house, water in pipes. Marcus talking to himself in the hallway in the low, focused way he had when he was working through something. The smell of whatever Sylvia was making downstairs, the small percussion of a life being assembled around him, and him inside it at last. He had spent 6 years building things that didn't need him the way this did. He had stood in 40-floor towers and felt less present than he did now. In this house, listening to a 5-year-old narrate the internal logic of a toy car through the wall. He got up. He went downstairs. He had found his way home.